Teal dear. In the desperate march ever onwards to ensure that women have to never take any sort of responsibility ever for any of their actions, it is now sexist to tell women to not drink alcohol when they are pregnant. Before this point in time, I merely wanted to get off of this planet. But these days I am increasingly finding myself wishing for some form of interdimensional travel, so that I can not only leave this entire planet behind, but also free myself from the pesky constraints of space and time. But in lieu of that, I guess I can settle for pointing out why this article and the people making this claim are complete and utter morons. So let's do that, shall we? Advising women not to drink when pregnant is sexist and causes needless anxiety, senior academics have said. Pregnancy charities and researchers have called for a change to the alarmist official government guidelines, which warn expectant mothers to avoid alcohol completely. They say the policy has no basis in evidence and ends up stigmatizing women and excluding them from society. So straight out of the gate, it seems like all of this is more about the feels than the reals. So let's look at some of the key points of this article. Well, one of the main points seems to be that following on from a general reduction in the weekly recommended intake of alcohol for everyone, pregnant women have been advised to not have alcohol at all. Whereas previously it was still recommended that they did not have alcohol at all, but if they just couldn't put the bottle down for 9 months out of their entire life, that they could have up to 2 units once or twice a week. Dr. Ellie Lee, the director of the Centre for Parenting and Cultural Studies at the University of Kent, has said that exclusion of women from an ordinary activity on the basis of a precaution was sexist. She then goes on to say that pregnant women who are seen drinking end up feeling self-conscious about it, and something to do with a social stigma that women who sip on a little bit of watered-down wine when they're pregnant seem to feel that literally everyone around them suddenly believes that they just cannonballed an entire bottle of vodka. Another part of her objection is that it is impossible to establish a safe level of exposure to alcohol during pregnancy. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And overall, she is campaigning for a change in the tone of advice on the topic of alcohol consumption and pregnancy. Because gosh darn it, you just can't talk to a woman in a tone that she doesn't like. Because it's not what you said, it's how you said it is truly the greatest plight that the world is facing at the moment. And another person by the name of Claire Murphy, the aforementioned organization's director of external affairs, complains that telling women not to drink alcohol when pregnant is causing them needless anxiety and alarm, and that some women just might go out and get an abortion that they didn't need to have because they got drunk one night and fear that they might have hurt their baby. So that's kind of the key points of the objections that people have to telling pregnant women to not drink alcohol. Because telling them to not potentially hurt their baby before it's even born might make them feel bad. So before we go any further to look at some relevant medical data, I would like to make one small suggestion. If you are a woman who is pregnant and you are incapable of simply not drinking alcohol for 9 months out of your entire life, I would suggest to you that you should probably seek some help because you have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. Not drinking is very easy. You just don't do it. If you are incapable of simply not doing it, that would suggest to me that you probably have some quite deep-seated psychological problems. Anyway, on to the medical data, because this is the part which is far more interesting. So one thing which I would like to note before going into this, one of the other objections that this organization has put forward is that there is not a huge amount of information around the topic of low to moderate alcohol consumption in pregnant women. Now, the reason for this lack of information should be pretty obvious, but I'm going to spell it out here for the sake of clarity. If you wanted to study the effects of alcohol consumption on pregnant women, you would need to get a few hundred probably a few thousand pregnant women, and you would have to administer to them controlled amounts of alcohol over controlled time periods at controlled times during their pregnancies, and you would then be measuring the cutoff point for negative effects on the baby when they are born, and you'd probably want to follow them for several years after the fact as well. That would be a massive ethical problem, because you are specifically looking to cause things that will mess people up for their entire lives. And when it comes to medical research, there's these pesky little things called ethics boards, which kind of stop you from doing that. However, that being said, there is still research being done on alcohol exposure to fetuses in humans, because some mothers actually just flatly refuse to stop drinking. And thus we do have some data to work with. So in digging up some of this research, I did intentionally try to focus on low to moderate alcohol exposure studies. So we're not going to be dealing with massive amounts of really obvious fetal alcohol spectrum disorder style symptoms. We're going to be looking at things which are a little bit more subtle. So we'll start out with a Brazilian study. Inattention and impulsivity associated with prenatal alcohol exposure in a prospective cohort study with 11-year-old Brazilian children. So this study took 449 third trimester pregnant women and had a follow-up phase with 56 mother-child pairs, 28 of which were alcohol exposed versus 28 of which were non-alcohol exposed, with the 11 to 12-year-old children. And a large variety of neuropsychological testing was used on the children, including an attention test, a verbal learning test, a complex figure test, a card sorting test, and basic IQ tests, as well as verbal fluency tests, and basic reading, writing, and arithmetic comprehension. The results that the children displayed in various categories was actually quite similar, but there were also some very stark contrasts. The alcohol-exposed children scored lower on copy, immediate, and delayed recall testing. They also scored lower on semantic verbal fluency tests. They were also found to be more inattentive, more impulsive, and to have poorer skills in general verbal fluency and visuospatial working memory. So perhaps rather unsurprisingly, the alcohol-exposed children displayed quite a few cognitive development problems. Now, one thing to note about this study, and it is the reason that I've got this out of the way first, women who took part in this test for alcohol exposure were chosen on the ground of any positive response to the consumption of alcohol. So there was no controlling for quantity of alcohol or the time over which the alcohol was taken. So this study was a little bit more of a scattergun approach to alcohol consumption in the mother. But it is just the first of many data points that I'm going to show you. Next up is a study that specifically looks at 22-year-old people who were exposed quite specifically to lower levels of alcohol. Obviously, at the age of 22, they're done growing. They're not really going to develop any more than they already have. So you can really start to see any long-lasting effects that low levels of alcohol consumption may have caused. And very conveniently, this study has one of these wonderful little summary boxes, which I really think should be an industry standard. And the results of this study were as follows. At 22 years, parental alcohol exposure significantly predicted behavior as measured with the adult self-report. These findings were significant controlling for covariates. Exposure at each trimester predicted increased behavior problems on the total score, internalizing, externalizing, attention, and critical item scales. Use across pregnancy predicted a higher rate of behavioral problems compared to no use and use in the first trimester only. So this is quite an interesting finding. Small amounts of alcohol in the first trimester aren't as damaging as small amounts of alcohol later in development, and small amounts of alcohol spanning the entirety of pregnancy seems to be the most damaging of all. So basically, if you have a little bit of alcohol before you know that you're pregnant, basically that first month, this study would seem to suggest that that bit of alcohol is less likely to harm your child than anything done later, although there is still the possibility that it will. Which is unsurprisingly why the conclusion says the effects were dose-response and significant at each trimester of pregnancy. However, duration across pregnancy was a better predictor than drinking during the first trimester only. binge drinking was not a better predictor of outcome compared to average daily volume, and within categories of ADV, binge drinking did not predict more problems than non-binge drinking. Thus, there is no safe level or safe time during pregnancy for women to drink. These data demonstrate that the effects of parental alcohol exposure, even at low to moderate levels, extend into young adulthood and are most likely permanent. And quickly, for anyone who's interested in exactly what they were measuring and how they did it, it was a self-reported test, and it was measuring anxiety and depression, withdrawn behavior, and somatic complaints, as well as tendency towards rule-breaking, aggressive behavior, and intrusiveness, as well as attention problems. And the critical items that were mentioned earlier was things like the offspring likelihood to use illicit drugs, tobacco, alcohol, marijuana, and so on, which was also something which was increased even with low levels of parental alcohol exposure. Next up is a piece which is a little bit more impressive. Moderate alcohol drinking in pregnancy increases risks for children's persistent conduct problems, causal effects in a Mendelian randomization study. And the really important part there is the Mendelian randomization. Putting it in the absolutely most simple way possible, Mendelian randomization looks at the genes of the people that you've got in your study, specifically genes which have known functions and effects, and it uses that as a basis for measuring the effects of external modifiable variables, things like diseases and other environmental factors. In this case, alcohol consumption. And this one's really important because it helps to remove the possibility that some of the behavioral problems we've seen in the previous two studies had some sort of genetic basis rather than being something caused by the alcohol ingestion of the mother. In this instance, this study is looking for genes which influence how alcohol is metabolized by the body, and then it's comparing that to alcohol consumption and non-alcohol consumption by the mother. So this will really nail it down as to the effect that alcohol has at relatively low levels on fetuses and child development, if any at all. And this study was looking at women who drank between 0 to 6 units of alcohol per week at any time in pregnancy, but not binge drinking. And you may recall that that was the level of alcohol consumption which used to be considered to be safe before it was recently amended to nothing at all. One thing to consider, though, is that as with all of these tests, that was self-reported by the women, so there is a possibility that they were lying. Anyway, the results of this study did find that there was a link between alcohol consumption and childhood conduct problems, especially early onset ones, which the authors of this paper then hypothesize may explain some of the later problems that we've seen in the previous two studies. That is, that some of the problems that you see later on may not be directly caused by the alcohol consumption, but are caused as a knock-on effect of these earlier problems, which are caused by alcohol consumption directly. I do have a few more studies along these lines, and a lot of them are very similar to all of these, to varying degrees, and unsurprisingly their results are all kind of similar. Large amounts of alcohol consistently is bad. When it comes to smaller amounts of alcohol, it starts to become a little bit more of a grey area. Small but regular amounts do seem to cause quite a bit of damage still. In fact, in some studies, small regular amounts does more damage than large irregular amounts. But then there's some studies which find the opposite. And then when it comes to really quite low levels of alcohol consumption, say less than 6 units of alcohol over the course of a week, it becomes even more of a grey area, with results varying from no effect in certain categories of mental development to some saying that yes, there is a negative effect. And it's this grey area that this article and this organization that's campaigning for women to be able to drink when pregnant are relying on. It's the very fact that sometimes in certain tests in certain areas there is no effect. Apparently that is a solid enough basis on which to build your castle of it's totally fine for women to drink small amounts of alcohol when they're pregnant. And this is something which I fundamentally disagree with, because the results from drinking even very small amounts of alcohol, even irregularly when pregnant, varies between no effect and messing up your child forever. And at that point, it becomes a question of why even take the risk? When the potential outcomes range from not very much to completely life-destroying problems, why would you even roll that die? It's just not worth taking that chance. Frankly, I would say the deficit in research of low-level alcohol exposure when pregnant, because of the horrendous ethical problems that such research would cause, that is not a good enough excuse to just go ahead with it and throw all caution to the wind and potentially mess up someone else's life forever. And just to add to this point, I'm going to show you another couple of studies. Because you see, we have a lot of very strict ethical controls around experimentation on people, especially around pregnancy and forced alcohol consumption. Mice, however, low and moderate prenatal ethanol exposure of mice during gastrulation and neurulation delays neurobehavioral development. Human and animal studies show significant delays in neurobehavioral development in offspring after prolonged prenatal exposure to moderate and high ethanol doses, resulting in high blood alcohol concentrations. However, none have investigated the effects of lower ethanol doses given acutely during specific developmental time periods. Here we sought to create a mouse model for modest and circumscribed human drinking during the 3rd and 4th weeks of pregnancy. We acutely treated mice during embryo gastrulation on gestational day 7, or neurulation on day 8, with a low or moderate ethanol dose given via gavage that results in BECs of 107 and 177 mg per deciliter respectively. We assessed neonatal physical development, pinnae unfolding and eye opening, and weight gain from postnatal day 3 through to 65, and neurobehavioral maturation, pivoting, walking, cliff aversion, surface writing, vertical screen grasp, and rope balance from PD3 to 17. We found that ethanol exposure during both time points, day 7 and 8, resulted in some delays of physical development and significant sensory-motoral delays of pivoting, walking, and thick rope balance, as well as additional significant delays in cliff aversion and surface writing after GD8 treatment. We also found that treatment with the low ethanol dose more frequently affected neurobehavioral development of the surviving pups than treatment with the moderate ethanol dose, possibly due to a loss of several affected offspring. Finally, mice born prematurely were delayed in their physical and sensory-motoral development. Importantly, we showed that brief exposure to low-dose ethanol, if administered during vulnerable periods of neuroanatomical development, results in significant neurobehavioral delays in neonatal mice. We thus expand concerns about alcohol consumption during the 3rd and 4th weeks of human pregnancy to include occasional light to moderate drinking. So, drunken mouse babies to the rescue. Turns out that exposing mouse embryos to low levels of alcohol causes the pups to develop a wide variety of problems when they're born. And this isn't the only study to have looked at this. There is another study. Deficits in spatial learning and memory in adult mice following acute, low or moderate levels of prenatal ethanol exposure during gastrulation and neurulation. And I'm sorely tempted to do a video on this study just by itself, because it's quite a long one, it's got a lot going on in it, and it's a really, really interesting one. And there's a whole host of maze tests and baiting tests and all sorts of things like that that the mice are being put through so that they can gather up all of the effects that alcohol exposure has had on them when they were in the womb. But to cut a very long paper short, this one found, again, unsurprisingly, very similar effects in the mice that were observed in humans. One of the most curious anomalies, though, was mice who had parental alcohol exposure. When placed into a water maze, which is exactly what it sounds like, it's a maze that the mice swim through, designed to test spatial recognition and memory, parental alcohol exposure mice froze when they were placed in the water. Most of them just did not swim. It's a very curious symptom for them to exhibit. Anyway, throughout a lot of the spatial awareness and memory testing, which is ultimately what mazes are designed for with mice, the alcohol-exposed group deviated quite a substantial way from the control group. Unsurprisingly, not for the better. And the alcohol-exposed mice also consistently showed problems with varying degrees of memory test. In fact, all of their results taken together showed that the prenatal alcohol-exposed mice exhibited behaviors that were akin to a mild form of ADHD. Like I said, I'm not going to go too much into this study because I really do want to do a video on it by itself. Whether or not I ever get around to doing that is anyone's guess. However, getting us back on topic, the new guideline of 0 units of alcohol for the entirety of your pregnancy, and that is all it is. It is a guideline. You don't actually have to do it, is there for a good reason. What little research we do have around alcohol consumption while pregnant, even in very small amounts, is not promising. Because no matter what the outcome, it's always either neutral or bad. Quite simply put, it is not a risk worth taking. Especially since it's not only your life that can be affected by it. Think about your baby, and don't mess things up for them before they have even had a chance to live, just because you can't control yourself. If you really feel like you're missing out on some major important social event in life just because you're not allowed to drink for 9 months, then you're probably not fit to be a parent yet.